As you grow up in life, we pick up habits along the way, and some habits are considered good, but some are considered bad. Over the time, even after you know that a specific habit is bad, there just come a time when you end up doing it, especially when there's no one to correct you. Sometimes it doesn't result to something bad, but when that bad habit and bad luck are added together, disaster strikes. Just like United Nations Flight 834. Join me on this video as we see how recklessness, inexperience, and bad luck brought this jet down. My name is Jonathan, and this is Minutes from Disaster. Stay tuned. April the 4th, 2011. It's a beautiful afternoon at 1340 local time in the country of DRC as United Nations Flight 834 makes its way on a 1 hour and 40 minutes flight from the city of Kisangani to the capital of DRC, Kinshasa. United Nations Flight 834, being a chartered flight, is being operated by a company called Georgian Airways. It is the privately owned flag carrier of the country of Georgia. It's Georgian Airways that provided the crew and the aircraft to the United Nations for its MONUSCO mission in the DRC. The aircraft operating this flight is a 16-year-old Bombardier CRJ-100ER, a little regional jet designed for these kinds of flights. On board the CRJ are a crew of 4, all being Georgian citizens, with 27 passengers, the majority being UN staff workers and others being from the DRC government. In the cockpit, at the left seat, is 27-year-old Captain Alexei Hovhannian. He has a total of 2,811 flight hours. 1,622 of them are on the CRJ. He had just been promoted as a captain of the CRJ approximately 3 months ago. He is the pilot flying today. At the right seat is 22-year-old co-pilot Suliko Tsutskiridze. He has a total of 495 flying hours. 344 of them are on the CRJ. He is fairly new to flying, and he is the pilot monitoring on this flight. In Kinshasa, they will be landing at Njili Airport. The weather at Kinshasa's Njili Airport is not looking good, with thunderstorms rolling in, but still stable enough to allow landings.
Approach United Nation 834. Requesting latest weather for Kinshasa.
Winds 210 at 8 knots. Visibility 8 kilometers. Thunderstorm in Charlie Bravo over airport. Temperature 33. QNH 1008. Trend no sig.
Weather copied, sir. Thank you. QNH 1008.
What is your level in DME now?
Passing flight level 100. DME 30. United Nation 834.
Cleared for the straight in approach for runway 24. Report reaching 4,500 feet and established on the localizer.
Cleared for the straight in approach. Report reaching 4,500 feet and call when established. United Nation 834.
4,500 set.
Check.
At 1350 local time, the pilots have been cleared to make a straight-in VOR approach. Just as the name says it, the plane will come in straight, going to a radio station called a VOR, with no restriction apart from the minimum decision altitude, which is the altitude that a plane cannot cross if the runway is not in sight. The pilots now have the thunderstorm in their sight. They are trying to see how they can pass it. But the dangerous thing about thunderstorm is that sometimes they are very unpredictable.
Look at how huge it is. If it gets worse, I think all we need to do is a 10 minutes hold at max. The clouds are moving.
What's the minimum altitude here?
It is 4,500 feet.
At 13:52 local time, the weather is getting intense around Njili Airport. The pilots start realizing how strong the storm is, but nonetheless, the pilots press on. And so 1 minute later, at 13:53 local time, the plane arrives at 4,500 feet, which is the safe altitude around Njili Airport.
Let's go through there and hope we see something.
All right, turn on continuous ignition.
Continues ignition on.
Check.
United Nation 834. What's your position now?
We are 14 miles inbound, maintaining 4,500 feet.
Copy. Descend to 3,500 feet and report reaching.
Report reaching United Nation 834.
Despite not having the runway in sight, the air traffic controller clears the plane to descend to 3,500 feet.
United Nation 834 is established on localizer for runway 24 passing 3,500 feet.
Contact tower on 1 to 18.1. Good landing.
Thank you.
All right, runway in sight.
At 13:54 local time, the pilots finally see the runway and start heading to it immediately.
Kinshasa Tower. Good afternoon. This is United Nation 834 on the localizer for runway 24.
United Nation 834 copy. Report on short final for runway 24.
Report short final. United Nation 834.
Flaps 8.
Speed check. Flaps 8.
We continue the approach.
United Nation 834, winds now at 280 degrees, at 25 knots, cleared to land.
Clear to land. United Nation 834.
At 13:55 local time, the pilots are cleared to land with somehow the runway in sight. But the storm is getting stronger as the seconds pass.
Cabin crew prepare for landing.
Set 3,500 as our go-around altitude.
Set
1,000.
Flaps 30.
speed normal, flaps 30, spoilers deployed. .500.
Flaps 45.
Speed too high for flaps, 45. Reduce speed a bit. Okay, now flaps 45.
Speed V ref.
Speed V ref.
Flight director off.
It's off. 300.
Windshield wipers.
Out of nowhere, rain falls and visibility drops.
No, I don't see anything. Let's go around.
Go around flaps 8.
Flaps 8.
Immediately, the pilot decides to do a go around.
United Nation 834 going around.
Damn it.
United Nation 834, say again.
Flaps up. Come on. Speed. Speed.
At 13:56 local time, United Nations Flight 834 crashes into the ground, killing everyone but one person on the plane. 32 people are lost. As soon as the weather got in, it quickly disappeared, leaving the DRC, the United Nations, and Georgian Airways to ask one question: why did this plane crash? Let's find out. After the crash, the Congolese led the investigation, and After a thorough investigation, it was concluded that 3 factors made it impossible for this crash to not happen. So let's start with the first factor, the weather. The weather around the airport was worse than what the pilots thought. It was not just a thunderstorm around the airport, but it was in truth a squall line. A squall line is basically a line of thunderstorms, and this line was approximately passing over the airport. And unfortunately, this weather phenomenon brings along a friend called a microburst. It is, in simple terms, a strong downward and outward gushing wind that comes out of a thunderstorm all the way to the ground. And these winds are usually at very high speeds and sometimes cause damage to the ground. This weather phenomenon has brought many planes down, like the famous Delta Airlines Flight 191. And sadly, United Nations Flight 834 has become one of them. As the pilots decided to do a go-around, the microburst attacked. Pilots have been trained on how to get out of a microburst, but the plane was just too low for the pilots to recover. Well, now you might ask yourself, so how do planes avoid microburst? This brings us to the second factor, the air traffic controller. It is the air traffic controller's job to warn pilots of the presence of a microburst using a terminal Doppler weather radar, which detects them. But unfortunately, Njili Airport did not have it. Well, here you might say that the air traffic controller did not do anything wrong then, since he did not have the right equipment. Wrong. After further investigation and after listening to the cockpit voice recordings, it was found out that he made a mistake when he was telling the pilots the weather.
Visibility 8 kilometers, thunderstorm in Charlie Bravo over airport, temperature 33, QNH 1008, trend no sig.
The term no sig means that the weather will remain the same for the next 30 minutes. This fooled the pilots to think that the good reported 8-kilometer visibility will remain the same, giving them the go-ahead to continue the approach, even though their onboard radar was showing them the opposite. In truth, the 8-kilometer visibility dropped fast and went below the minimal visibility to do this approach. This alone should have given the controller authority to temporarily close the airport, which in turn could have made the pilots do a go-around before reaching where the microburst was. But he did nothing, as the visibility got worse and worse and left the doomed plane to continue the approach. So, can we say that it was the air traffic controller's fault that caused the crash? No. Even though the air traffic controller made mistakes and the weather decided to make a sneak attack, this crash was still preventable by 2 people, which brings us to the third factor, the pilots. In order to understand how the pilots flew the plane on this flight, the investigators looked at the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. And after a thorough investigation, 4 mistakes were found. 1. No satisfactory briefing of the landing was done. 2. High speed on descent and approach. 3. An unstable approach. And finally, 4. Not following procedures. So let's begin with the first one. No satisfactory briefing of the landing was ever done by this crew before commencing the approach. A landing briefing is very important because it gives the pilots a guideline on how they will execute the approach safely. Without this briefing, it brings us to the next mistake. Maybe due to lack of briefing or just negligence. On the descent and approach, the speed was very, very high. Below 10,000 feet, the standard limit is 250 knots, but they ignored that rule and stayed at high speeds. They continued all the way until they were around 4 nautical miles away from the runway. That's when they started slowing down. And from the descent all the way to the moment of the crash, they never reached their target landing speed. This high speed gave the pilots less time to process what was happening, since everything was happening so fast. And this brings us to the third mistake. Because of this high speed, the approach was unstable. In aviation, it's a golden rule to have everything ready before reaching the minimum decision altitude, which is the altitude that a pilot cannot cross without having the runway in sight and without having a stable approach. If not ready, then the pilots have no choice but to do a go around and try again. As for these pilots, the approach was not stable. The typical approach speed for the CRJ-100ER is between 120 knots to 130 knots. But these pilots were flying higher than that, at around 150 knots and more. A normal crew would have done a go around before reaching the minimum, just simply because of the bad weather and the abnormal speed. All of this turned the approach into an unstable one. But why did the pilots do so? This brings us to the final mistake. The pilots were not following procedure. The fact that they were flying fast on approach and not going around when things were getting bad means that the pilots decided to stop following procedures. And the fact that they did it without any of them saying anything about it means that this was not the first time they had done something like this. To know why, we need to look a bit into the pilot's history to understand why they did what they did. 27-year-old Captain Alexei had a total of 2,811 flying hours, and 1,622 of them were on the CRJ. He had just been promoted as a captain of the CRJ approximately 3 months ago before the disaster, and only had 217 hours as a captain on the CRJ. Technically speaking, 2,594 flying hours is, in standards, very low for someone to become a captain. Most airlines require a pilot to have at least 3,000 flying hours to start considering someone to become a captain. Looking deeper, we see that the captain only did one simulator training for his upgrade to the CRJ-100ER, which is not enough. So, at the left seat, we had an inexperienced captain who was badly upgraded to the role. So, no matter how you look at it, mistakes were bound to happen. 22-year-old co-pilot Suliko had a total of 495 flying hours, and 344 of them were on the CRJ. He was very fresh in the aviation industry and very inexperienced. A newly appointed pilot like Suliko needs a very experienced captain at his side to show him the way and to correct him in case of mistakes. But he did not get that at all. Considering how inexperienced the two were, in reality, it was a very bad idea to pair these two pilots together in the first place. The two of them started working in DRC 2 to 3 months ago, which is close to the day that the captain was promoted to captaincy, which means that the majority of his time flying as a captain were in DRC. But this does not explain why the pilots broke so many rules like they did. Because every company has a way of making sure that things like that don't happen thanks to something called a Flight Operations Quality Assurance Program. It is a program that, after a flight is done, takes the flight data recorder and analyzes it and gives feedback to the airline about errors and things that need to be corrected. In a simple term, it is a way to monitor the company's pilots, and it also forces pilots to fly following procedures, because if they do not, then they will be reported and may suffer consequences. But unfortunately, this program was only in Georgia and was not active in other countries where their aircrafts were found. This ultimately explains why the pilots were not following procedures. They knew that even if they broke procedures on their flights, there will be no way to report them to the company. And another reason may have been because DRC has no radar to show air traffic controllers the location, altitude, and speeds of planes till today. So with this mindset, they went on to break a lot of procedures, not knowing that the consequence of breaking these procedures was waiting for them at the beginning of the runway. The flight data recorder later reveals that the same crew on the same plane did the same thing and broke procedures on 2 other flights before the accident one. Having done the same thing 2 times with nothing happening created a belief in the pilot's head that everything would work out as well on the 3rd time, not knowing that fate forgives you when you do a mistake 2 times, but when you decide to do it for the 3rd time, fate says enough is enough. Now, with everything that we've learned, let us go minute to minute as we see the chains of events. It all begins 2 to 3 months before the accident flight, when Georgian Airways sends a newly appointed and inexperienced captain and a very inexperienced co-pilot who still needs guidance to the DRC, making a very bad pairing to operate the CRJ-100ER in a place known for harsh environments. The airline makes a second mistake by not making a flight operations quality assurance program for the 2 pilots in DRC. With these 2 mistakes done, time goes on and slowly, without supervision, the 2 pilots start skipping procedures. Since there is no one around to control them, bringing us to April the 4th, 2011, 1 hour and 40 minutes from disaster. The procedure skipping crew takes off at Kisangani's Bangoka International Airport for its flight to Kinshasa. The climb and cruise is smooth, and then at 13:39 local time, 17 minutes from disaster, the pilots begin their descent into Kinshasa without doing a proper briefing of the landing, and thus begin the chains of mistakes that the crew will make. At 13:50 local time, 6 minutes from disaster, the plane descends below 10,000 feet. And here, the pilots make the second mistake. They ignore the speed restriction and continue descending at a very high speed, which in turn makes the landing more challenging. They have been told that the weather won't change in the next 30 minutes and that the visibility is 8 kilometers by the air traffic controller. But contrary to what the controller says, the weather is deteriorating fast by minutes. The air traffic controller doesn't know because the airport is not equipped with a weather radar. But the pilots can clearly see how bad the weather is on the plane's onboard weather radar. But still, the pilot decides to ignore that and continue the approach. And so, at 13:54 local time, 2 minutes from disaster, the pilots finally see the runway for a bit. So, they continue the approach, with the weather getting worse and worse. From here, the visibility starts to drop and goes below the minimum required to land, which is 2,000 400 meters of visibility. But the controller does not close the airport and lets the crew continue the approach. And so at 13:56 local time, 43 seconds from disaster, the plane passes the minimum decision altitude, but the plane is not properly configured to land, and the approach is very unstable, with the plane going 45 knots more than the speed that was supposed to be flown at that altitude. Still, the pilots press on, breaking another procedure. Moments later, Mother Nature strikes by first introducing heavy rainfall and then reducing the visibility to a near zero. And so 22 seconds from disaster, the captain finally decides to do a go around. But Mother Nature strikes again by introducing an enemy to the aviation world called a microburst. With the strong wind direction and velocity change, the wings lose lift, making the nose drop. The pilots try to recover, but due to being low, there simply is no more space for the plane to recover. The plane crashes into the ground, killing almost everyone but one person on board. Although a lot of events played in this crash, in the end, the cause of this crash by far goes to the pilots. In truth, if the pilots had flown slower, then there is a possibility that they could have arrived when the microburst had already moved away. But I guess there's no way to change the past. May all the 32 people who lost their lives rest in peace. Thanks for watching this video. If you like it, then please don't forget to subscribe, comment, and to like the video. And if you want to support me in the Minutes from Disaster project, then please consider buying me some coffees, link in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching. Have a great day.